In this video from jewelrysupply.com, I'm going to show you how to do a Viking Knit weave. I'm going to show you step by step how to create the actual weave, and then I'm going to show you a neat little trick to make your weaving nice and tidy. One of the questions that we receive when people are starting to work out with wire is, well, what gauge should I start off with? Well, it's all a matter of preference. You see, these two bracelets here are the exact same project, however, they have different gauge wires. This one over here on the left uses a 20 gauge wire in a red artistic wire color. This is the project that we're going to focus on for this video. This is the same kind of artistic wire, but in a powder blue, and this is in a 24 gauge wire. I like to recommend to people when they're first starting off with wire to use the thinnest gauge that they can get away with, only because it's much easier to bend as opposed to working with 20 gauge or even higher wire. You can do it, and by all means, if in this project you want to use a 20 gauge wire, go for it. But if you're just starting out, and if you want something that has a bit of flexibility and forgiveness with it, try a smaller wire, like a 24 or a 22 gauge wire. And for reference, the number for the artistic wire that we're going to be using is CW2422. Now as we focus on this bracelet for a second, let's look at some of the other components that will make up this bracelet. As you can see, I have pewter cones that I'm going to be using to seal off the ends. The item numbers for these are BC4027. Also, to give a touch of color to this project when it's done, I'm going to add some Swarovski round crystals. These are 8mm, and the item number is RB8025. To really contrast the color, I'm using a pad Paraja color, but of course you can use any color that you desire. To finish things off, we're going to be using a magnetic clasp. Now this is a clasp that I really like, only because it's extremely sturdy, and once it snaps together, it takes a little bit to get it apart. Perfect for a bracelet application. This is item number CL2520. One of the tricks that I found in making this bracelet is that it pays to use a thicker gauge wire to reinforce the ends of your thinner gauge bracelet. You can't really see how this technique is done here, but you will need about 10 inches of nickel silver wire, item number WN020, cut down further into two 5-inch lengths of wire. Some of the tools that you're going to need for this project, of course, are your staples. You're going to need a side cutter, you'll definitely need a chain nose plier, and of course, for the end, you'll need a round nose plier. One of the other pliers that you'll need for this project is a set of flat nose pliers, and this is item number PL193. Later on in this video, I'm going to show you how to take your weaving through something that's called a draw plate. Another tool that you'll need is a bench vise. This is item number BP110. I like this bench vise because, of course, it locks in on your countertop that you're using, but it swivels in two different places. So you can customize it to really get it right in front of you, and you don't have to hunch over the vise or work around the vise. The vise will accommodate you. You're also going to need a ruler. If you don't have a ruler, you can also use a credit card or another type of rigid card so that you can do the first step in your Viking Knit weave. One of the most important tools for doing the Viking Knit weave, at least that I've found, is a little Allen wrench. This is a 1/4 inch Allen wrench, so it's a little bigger than what you're used to seeing, but this is something that I love to use doing Viking Knit weave. You'll find other instructions that say to use a wooden dowel. I suggest give it a shot, see how you like it. I like an Allen wrench because it has flat sides to it. Our Viking Knit weave will consist of 5 sides, so having a 6-sided Allen wrench, while you might have an extra side here, works out great. You're able to twist the knitting as you're doing it, and you have a flat side in order to get your wire through. And while that may be absolutely confusing right now, it'll make perfect sense towards the end of the video. And of course, whenever you're working with wire, make sure that you have safety glasses. Okay, now that we've gone over all of our tools that we're going to be using for this project, let's get down to actually making it. The very first thing that you want to do is to position your vise properly on your countertop. Make sure that the bottom is secured to the countertop, of course, but take a second and position the head of this vise so that it's sitting right in front of you so that you have the ease of working without fighting with the vise. You're going to take your Allen wrench, and there's a certain way to put the Allen wrench into the vise. The short end of this Allen wrench is going to go into the vise with the long portion of it faced off to the left. Now, of course, if you're left-handed, you're going to switch this around, but since I'm right-handed, it's going to head off to the left. And after you have this whole area set and ready to go, now you can focus on cutting your wire. You're going to be taking upwards of 36 to 38 inches of wire off of the spool. So after you have that set and ready, grab one end of your wire, and you're going to take out your ruler, or if need be, a credit card. You're going to allow there to be a pretty significant tail up here at the top. Make sure that it's at least your hand width, if not a little bit longer. Hold with your non-dominant hand on your thumb and then wrap the wire around the ruler 6 times, like so. What you're going to have is 5 loops and then you're going to have your wire coming up off the side of the ruler. Perfect. Slide all of your wire off of the ruler, and what you're going to have is a really cool design, number one, but this is the beginning of your Viking knit. Pinch with your non-dominant hand one end of all of your loops. Now take the index finger of your dominant hand and place it in the loops. Take your thumb and your forefinger of your other hand and pinch this loop closed, like so. Reposition it, so now you can hold on to the bigger portion of the loop with your dominant hand, and you're going to take your non-dominant hand and you're going to wrap that tail around where you pinched 3 times. You're going to take the end of your wire and you're going to go through that small loop. Now that you have your loop secured over here on this side, you're going to take your fingers and you're going to pry each of these loops apart. It almost looks like a really cool kind of flower when you're done. It doesn't matter really what side you put the wire loops to, automatically they're going to fall to one side or the other. But after you have your neat flower design, you're going to take your fingers now and you're going to flatten each of the petals out so that they're fairly flat. Just make sure that the loops at the ends of each of your petals are fairly open. You want to be able to fit the wire through each of these loops, and you'll see what I mean here in this very next step. So now we're back over here to our bench vise. Here's our Allen wrench, and here's where we're going to secure the very middle of our flower to the Allen wrench. Now what you do is you take your fingers and you basically press all of the petals against each side of the Allen wrench. Now remember, an Allen wrench has 6 sides, however our flower petal only has 5. So you're going to have a bit of a space in between a couple of the petals. We'll be able to remedy that as soon as we start weaving. Turn your weaving over so that the wire coming away from the rest of your flowers is sitting right in front of you. Take the end of your wire and you're going to go in from the top through the bottom in the loop just above where your wire was coming out of that flower. So as you see, here's where the wire started in between these 2 loops, and then I've come back down and through the next loop. When you're pulling your wire through, and here's something that gets a lot of people hung up and frustrated very quickly, wire doesn't work like string. You can't pull on wire and just expect it to fall into place. You have to finesse it. So when you're working with a long length of wire like this, pull a little bit and come back to the beginning and pull through again. Keep in mind that the next time we come around this knitting, we're going to go behind this loop, so we don't want to cut ourselves completely off. So I'm going to tug just a tiny bit, and when I mean a tiny bit, I mean a tiny bit. And then you're going to bring your wire up here to the top. And so again, we're bringing our wire around, and we're pulling just until we get a little bit of resistance. Now we're going to bring it back up again. Now, as you're looking at this, you're going, whoa, whoa, wait a minute. Those 2 loops don't match up. That's fine. Don't worry about that. When you really get going, and when this really starts taking shape, it's almost as though the wire just kind of falls into place. Now we're right back here at the beginning. You're now going to go back behind that loop. Pull until you get a tiny bit of resistance, and voila. Now you're going to do the same thing again. After you worked with this end of wire for so long, what will wind up happening is the very end of your wire will wind up getting very kinked up, and all you simply have to do is just cut that away and then work with the next section of wire. No problem. As you continue to work with your knitting, you can remove your non-dominant hand from the very end of this. It helps out a lot because then you can incorporate this hand into pulling your wire through. And then when I get to that very last part of my loop, I like to kind of hold it down just so I know it's not going to move anywhere, and then gradually bring my finger through. Notice that I'm taking my finger and I'm using it to make the loop. In other words, I'm not grabbing the end of the wire and just pulling it tight. That would cause a huge kink in my wire and not something that I really want. One thing that you're going to notice, and one thing that always happens to me, so don't even worry about that, is that you're going to see these spaces either get bigger or get smaller with each of these loops. Notice how wide that is, but more importantly, notice how close that is. This can be alleviated with how you place your loops. When you run into sections that are close to each other, make a fairly relaxed loop. This will cause your weaving to kind of bend away from one another. When things are looking like they're pretty far apart, like in this next group, what you're going to want to do is make a smaller loop. This is going to cause your weaving to get closer to one another. Okay, so I've gone through and I have about 4 inches of wire left, but it's getting very hard for me to pull the wire through, so that's a pretty good indication to me that I'm done with this length of wire, but I'm not done with my knitting. So as I remove this knitting, we're going to look at the very end. What I want to see is I want to see 5 sides to my knitting, and I want them to be fairly spaced apart. So if you have 2 areas that are right next to each other and it kind of doesn't look like a pentagon, you want to remedy that in your next section of weaving with your new piece of wire. There's a couple of different ways of going about attaching a new section of wire. When you're looking at different instructions from different artists, you may find that some people have a different way of doing things, and that's fine. This is a way that I like to do it, and for me, my work seems fairly hidden after I draw my work through my draw plate, so I'm okay with this technique for adding new wire to my Viking Knit weave. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut my wire with about 1/4 of an inch tail, and then you're going to take your chain nose pliers and you're simply going to tuck that tail on the inside of your knitting, like so. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull off one loop from my artistic wire. Now let's take a look at the knitting that we've done so far. You'll notice that the wire came up, made a loop, and then was heading up again to continue with the rest of the knitting. So bring the tail of the wire through the bottom of this last loop, and then take your thumb and your forefinger and make a quick loop just to secure the wire tail to the rest of your knitting. This is where it gets just a tad bit tricky, but hey, if this is the only tricky part of the technique, this is a pretty easy technique to learn. I'm going to hold that tail down with my non-dominant hand. Now I'm going to put a little bit of force on this because I don't want that to slide around too much. After the next 2 loops are tightened and secured, you can remove your hand from holding that wire tail on the Allen wrench. As far as this wire tail is concerned, I'm just going to leave it where it's at and knit around it. I'm not going to cut it off or bend it back into the knitting. It'll be virtually invisible after going through the draw plate. When you come back to where you attached your wire, reposition your tail if you need to, and then you're going to treat this whole section as though it was a loop. Sometimes when you're working with thicker wire, this can be a difficult part because there's not a lot of room between the bottom of your wire group and the Allen wrench. If that's the case, simply slide your work off the Allen wrench, work with that end of the wire until you can get it through to the other side, and then move the wire carefully back onto the Allen wrench. And I say carefully because sometimes some of these loops down here can get caught up on the end of your Allen wrench, and that will throw your whole design out of whack down here, where you have to go back and remedy everything and fix the problem that's back here instead of moving forward. So I've made the very last loop in my knitting. Take a look at this knitting very quickly. You'll see that I'm finished with my knitting, and it does have a tube shape to it, although it is really far from perfect. You can see imperfections in here where we added or where we removed wire, and you can also see where the loops got wider or smaller based on how we knit. So now it's time to move on to the next step and make this knitting look beautiful. So to put the final touches on our knitting, we'll be taking our work through a draw plate. Typically a draw plate is used to reduce a gauge of wire by pulling the wire through a series of decreasing hole sizes on a draw plate with the aid of either flat nose pliers or specialty draw tongs. This rosewood draw plate in particular, item number DP120, fits easily into your bench vise for added leverage, but if you'd like a handheld version, we now carry a plastic draw plate, item number DP150. If you want to make a draw plate that's customizable, you can always make your own. Now this is just a piece of scrap wood that I had laying around my house, and it certainly isn't pretty, and it serves no other function than to be my draw plate. I have it long enough that I don't need to put it into the bench vise, I simply hold onto it with my non-dominant hand. The nice thing about making your own draw plate is that you can customize what size holes you drill into it, like I've done here. To start, what you'll do is you're going to come back to the very beginning where you took your wire tail and you looped it back through that smaller loop of 5 petals in the very beginning of this video. This is what you're going to hold on to initially with your flat nose pliers. What you'll do is you'll come through the back of the draw plate and you'll fit your wire through. Now I can tell just by looking at this that this hole is very big for my knitting. In other words, it's not really going to reduce by much at all. The way that you tell that is whether or not your first 5 petals will come through the draw plate with ease. So as you see, I now grab on with my flat nose pliers right there at the base of my knitting and I pull through. So now as I'm looking at my knitting, that really didn't do anything, so I'm going to take the next step down. Now with this hole, I'm meeting a lot more resistance, and I'm really having to pull down and clamp down on this end of the knitting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in pretty close so you guys can see exactly what I'm going to do here, but as I pull this knitting through the draw plate, you're going to see that the wire will become tighter and closer together, removing most of those imperfections that I have throughout my knitting. I've gone through the draw plate twice now with my knitting, and look at what's happened. Most of the spacing issues that we encountered while we were knitting have been taken care of, and our work looks much more uniform than before. Now, take your knitting through the next size down on your draw plate to really see results. So, as you can see, after taking my knitting through the 3rd hole on the draw plate, the overall length of my knitting has increased because of how much the wire has compressed. With that compression, you'll notice that the knitting has become much more flexible, as well as removing even more of the blemishes that were seen before taking the knitting through the draw plate. I feel pretty good about stopping here and creating my finished bracelet out of what I have here. With my ruler, I'm going to measure out my knitting. I have 7 inches of wire here, but I only need 5 in order to complete my bracelet. So with my side cutters, I'm going to cut 1 inch off each end of my knitting. So as carefully as you can, you're going to take your side cutters and you're going to make a straight line with how you cut. Now, something else that you're left with is you're going to have loose pieces of wire here on the end. So you want to go through and make sure that you remove any of those, and you're going to have a wire tail. This is the part of your looping where it came through and it was continuing on the side that you cut off. Well, here you can take your chain nose pliers and you can simply tuck that tail back into itself, which is exactly what I'm going to do right now. Just like so. So now I have a nice clean end with 4 loops, 5 if I want to count the loop beneath these 4 up here at the top, that I get to work with. Now, one of the great things about ending your knitting up here is that it doesn't have to be clean. Let me show you what I mean by that. I'm going to take a small amount of my 20 gauge wire, probably about 4 to 5 inches worth of wire, and if you have to, go ahead and snip the end of the wire off so that you have a fairly clean end to work with. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to take my round nose pliers and I'm going to make a fairly decent sized loop here at the end. And all that I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get all 4 of those loops onto my hook. If you need to come in and do any finessing with your chain nose or your round nose pliers, by all means, go ahead and do that. There, so now I have all 4 of the loops onto my loop of 20 gauge wire. And it doesn't have to look pretty, you just need to get all 4 of the loops on there. Now, take your cone and slide it onto the wire. There we go. Nice clean finish, right? You can't even tell what I did to try to attach that 20 gauge wire. Now slide on the 8mm Swarovski crystal round, and then you're going to start a wrapped loop. Then I'm going to attach the one end of my magnetic clasp onto my loop, like so, and then finish things off by wrapping the loop. As a helpful reminder, double check your measurement for the unfinished side of the bracelet now. You have the overall measurements for 1/2 of the bracelet, including the cone and the overall measurement of the clasp. So, plug in this figure to make sure that you're still on track before you make that final cut. Repeat all of the same steps again with this side of the bracelet, from attaching the 20 gauge wire to the knitted wire loops, to attaching the final cone as well as the 8mm Swarovski round crystal. Begin to make a wrapped loop with the end of your wire, making sure to connect this loop to the other end of your magnetic clasp. So I'm just tucking the tail of my very last wrap loop, and there you have it. Now you have made yourself a bracelet that looks extremely difficult to make, but as you know, was extremely easy to actually do. And you have a really cool bracelet to show off your work.